Here we are, talking about coaching, special issue psychedelics. I've been wanting to do this for quite a while to, start talking to people about coaching and psychedelics and how they could work together. And then we've met. And the idea is that we have a series of conversations with coaches who are practicing in the space of psychedelics, who work with psychedelics, either helping clients to get something out of their psychedelic experience or help clients who had an experience to integrate them and just kind of explore what's going on in that space. So Heather, thank you so much for being here with me. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you. So I am a new coach. I'm just starting out. I've been a nurse for 13 years maybe now, while healthcare in the United States is not really about the patient getting better or improving. And I really wanted to find a space for me to work with people one-on-one to be able to get healthier or improve their lives or become happier. And I am someone that wasn't happy and have learned how to do that, to take care of myself. And now it's become a passion of mine to help other people get there, because I think in at least my society where we are, we're not really encouraged to do that. And so for me, being in a more positive place with people and getting them to where they want to be, and I think psychedelics are a really good fast track to be there. That's why kind of this came up in the first place, is how are other people using them as coaches? Because I think they are a unique way. I mean, we see them in therapy a lot here and other environments, but for coaching, I think it's a really unique place.
Especially now, I think it's a really unique place because there's been a substantial amount of research in the past 15 years. I mean, the research was dead for like 40 years. And then in 2004, I think, was the first study by Ron Griffith around using psychedelics for depression, or rather against depression. But that kind of kicked off a whole renaissance of research. And it's been incredibly fascinating what's come out of it. I mean, it's mind-blowing, really, from a scientist's standpoint, the kind of results that one sitting with psychedelics with some therapy before and after has helped people treat hard-to-treat depression, like treatment-resistant depression. They had incredible results with smoking cessation, taking death anxiety away for late-stage cancer patients. And for me, it was like, whoa, on a scientific perspective, that's incredible. That's literally incredible. And so then I started reading some of the papers, and particularly one that by a couple of colleagues from Berlin, Andrea and Hendrik Jungabele. They looked at all the positive psychology concepts that have been reported within psychedelic research. And given that I have a background in positive psychology, that was fascinating because they reported all of these side effects, so to speak, of like more happiness and life satisfaction and, being more mindful, more open, insight, growth. So the positive psychologist and the coach in me is like, oh my God. So it's not just healing and fixing problems. It's also growth and development and going beyond that, which is what positive psychology and coaching are about. It's not about necessarily fixing problems, but learning, development, growth, insight. So yeah, it's a fascinating space to be in because right now we're still exploring it. There's no rules or guidelines. There's coaches out there who are practicing, and this is why we're talking, because I think it's important that we learn from each other, because clients will not wait until they do psychedelics or they use them for personal growth. There's so many people who are not suffering from PTSD who want to use those substances for personal growth and development, and they'll either do it on their own or they get some support. And I think it's better that they have some support. And while the guidelines are still not clear and the science will probably take 5-10 years to kind of catch up with the coaching and psychedelics, I think it's important that coaches ask themselves, how can we do this kind of support and offer it safely and ethically and legally?
I mean, for me, I really do feel like they saved my life, and I did not have a structured environment with it. I just can't imagine like when you do combine the two, like how extremely powerful that can be. The studies have shown that for decades longer, you attribute, your positive mentality or your change in thought process due to those psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what, as a coach, I'm really interested in, because sometimes it has a lasting effect for years, decades, months, at least weeks. And some people, they have these amazing experiences and they come back from an ayahuasca session or a psychedelic trip somewhere, an experience in a retreat center, or, I know many people just do that with friends. But they come back from this experience and they have all of these insights and this energy and these ideas. And then you meet them 2 months later and then nothing really has changed and the afterglow has kind of worn off and they've fallen back into old structures and habits. And I think this is where the integration work is so powerful because especially with coaching, it helps you to take some insights that you've had and integrate them into your life in practical ways. And that's what coaches do, not just with psychedelic experience, but with any kind of experiences or learning.
It's hard. I mean, we live these crazy lives. I mean, now it's a little different with COVID, but we're going to work every day. We're in the commute every day. And so it is really easy to lose track of the things that you learned, the inspiration that you had during those times. And that's why I do believe they're such a good marriage with coaching, because it does help you keep that mainframe and continue to make change.
You've got some questions, right? And this is why we started talking. You're like, well, I'm curious about a bunch of things. And we've talked briefly before we meet here and what would be useful to ask coaches who are practicing in this space. I'll just let you be the guide of this conversation and ask me anything you like. Worst case scenario, say, I don't want to talk about that. But I'm generally quite an open book.
Well, thank you. And if I don't talk about anything that you think is important, let's bring that up as well. I'd like to just hear about your current coaching practice, what that looks like, how you incorporate psychedelic medicines, and what you are today with your practice.
I came from positive psychology, as I mentioned earlier briefly. I've done a master's in applied positive psychology. That's how I found coaching. And I've always been interested in the intersection or in the gray area, the space between coaching and therapy. So initially I was interested in therapy and counseling, and then I found coaching, and it kind of resonated a lot more with me because I had a lot more freedom. You tend to work in therapy, you tend to work with people who feel unable to cope or who feel a bit broken or, who are at their wits' end in how to move on. I know there's a lot of people also who go to therapy because they want to explore themselves at depth, which I absolutely appreciate. And I think maybe in America, it's more common than in the UK. In the UK, it's certainly, you go see a therapist, you have some deep-seated issues and you really need to do something about it. It's not generally something that people just pursue out of curiosity. So I gelled with coaching, but I wanted to go deeper. A lot of the positive psychologists that I had met were really positive, perhaps a little bit too positive for my taste. And I needed an approach to coaching that would appreciate the challenges that life throws at you on a daily basis. And, all the shit that people experience, all the pain and suffering and the meaninglessness and the uncertainty and the inner conflicts, dilemmas, the paradoxes we carry as part of our human condition. So that's how I found existentialism. And I was lucky enough that I was at the right place at the right time. And Amy van Derzen and Monica Hanaway had just founded the first master's in existential coaching. So I joined at cohort 2 and I got in touch with the philosophy and all those existential questions and how you can incorporate them into your coaching. And I fell in love with it. And I knew the kind of positive attitude because I saw existential philosophy through a positive psychology lens. So I had learned about all the pillars of happiness and well-being and what it means to live a good life and character strength and hope and optimism and post-traumatic growth rather than stress. But then I had that framework of existentialism, which allowed me to explore the big questions in life. And it allowed me to help others explore the big questions in life. Who am I? Why are we here for? How can we be happy? How can I navigate life with all its challenges? How can I embrace my human condition? Is there a God? Is there free will? What does it all mean? Is there a point to any of this? So all of these big ones that kind of float under the surface of what somebody brings into the coaching space, I had an approach where I can actually help people to grapple with these big questions. And naturally, some traditional boundaries towards therapy, they will get breached with existential work. And quite naturally, the psychedelic endeavor of so many people of looking for a point or a meaning, exploring something at a great depth, these existential questions, they pop up all over the space when people get in touch with psychedelics. For me, that immediately made sense as when I had my first psychedelic experiences, a lot of these questions opened up and there were some real insights. Obviously, this is my journey and it's quite different. I met this guy who just looked at his washing machine every weekend on acid for 8 hours. So I think everybody uses it in a slightly different way. Yeah, spinning was beautiful, he said. But there was no endeavor to grow from the experience. It was recreational. And that's not what coaching in psychedelics is about. I think coaching in psychedelics is for people who want to utilize the doors. They want to open the doors that psychedelics open and they want to go through it and explore what's behind and then go beyond that actual experience and look at how am I different? How's my life different now that I've experienced that. And now that I'm back in the real world, so to speak, or out of that state of consciousness, how can I make sense of that experience? What have I learned about myself? And what can I take from this in order to integrate into my life? So I've made all of these connections, and I figured how to bring these together. And then I started asking questions, and I've been talking to other coaches for a few years now. There's all this research. How might we bring these two together? And then it took another year or two until I've actually wrote up an offer of how it might look like if I were to work with somebody. The first time I had a client who had a psychedelic experience and I wanted to make sense of it and integrate it, I was really surprised at how little different it was to my normal coaching, so to speak. And I was almost a little disappointed because I thought it was going to be different somehow. I had offered them something where, like, look, I'm still new in this space. If you wanted to explore that, I'm exploring that too. We could explore it together. I knew it was safe enough because that person was solid. The experience was a little while ago. We agreed if anything got opened up, that might be a space that is too vulnerable. There was a therapist on hold, so to speak, that knew where to go if we opened something up that the coaching space couldn't hold. But the content that they were bringing was weird. The experiences that somebody has on a psychedelic trip we might not have a reference point for that. So listening to it just kind of leaves you in a more uncertain space than when you're listening to somebody talking about a dispute with their manager or, something they've experienced with their partner, or in a normal life where we have a reference point of what that might be like. So the listening was a bit different. But after the first 20, 30 minutes of, telling me what they've experienced, it was just normal coaching, how to help somebody make sense of something that they've experienced and hold a space where the client can find their own answers to something. You do some contracting in the beginning to figure out would you like to get to? What would you like to get out of this relationship? So try to set goals as clearly as you can. But, if they might be a bit vague, as an existential coach, I'm okay with that. Sometimes we have conversations and things shift as a result of this conversation. And that's very much my experience when working in psychedelic integration than when I was working with any other client. In a way, my coaching didn't change, but the content of what the client brings, that changed a lot. So, and that's most of my work that I've been doing. Somebody had an experience and then they come to coaching to discuss that. I've also started working with people who had made a decision already to go have a psychedelic experience somewhere where that's legal. That's my condition. I don't condone illegal use of psychedelics. As a professional, I can't condone illegal use of psychedelics. So if anybody asks me, should I go do psychedelics? I say, I cannot possibly tell you that. If somebody comes to me and says, I've decided to try out psychedelics for this and this and this endeavor, and I feel that, they're not in a space where they're very vulnerable and might better work with a therapist or a mental health professional, I'd say, tell me about that. If they have made that decision and I feel that this is going to be, this is safe, they have the capacity to do that, and they're going to do that in a legal retreat center, for example, in the Netherlands or somewhere else where it's not illegal, then I can hold that same space, that coaching space, where I give them time to think about, what might they get out of it, setting intentions, setting goals around this. I won't teach them or tell them what the risks are. I won't be sharing my knowledge necessarily. Some knowledge I think is useful to share, but we know relatively little about, for example, microdosing. There's so much, the research still has to kind of catch up. We know enough to know that it's relatively safe, at least for LSD and psilocybin. The risk psychopharmacology is very low. So that's all right with me, but the client needs to make those decisions. I'm not in a position as a coach to advise them to take a certain substance or a certain dose or do it in a certain space. As a coach, I can, at least in my opinion, I think I can only hold that space where my client makes decisions for themselves. There is a few books that deliver good information as far as I'm concerned, but I would only ever, as a coach, put something on the table and say, well, here's some resources that point you to other resources that point you to other resources. And I encourage my clients to do their research before they, in preparation for this kind of experience, so that they can weigh the risks and that they can make a decision. They might come in with a decision, they might change that decision, and that's okay. But if they still want to go ahead with it, then they can do that. But the responsibility responsibility is firmly with the client. As a coach, as a professional, I have to make sure that my client is in a position to make that decision, to make an informed decision. So this is where, as a professional, I need to be a bit careful. If somebody comes to me and I don't feel they're in a position where they can give me informed consent to work, then I cannot work with them. This is the kind of ethical framework that I guess every coach has to decide for themselves.
So for someone new coming to you, how would you describe your practice? Are you an integration coach? Are you a coach that works with people not using psychedelics and people who are? How do you see your coaching practice?
I don't work predominantly with psychedelics. It's more of, it's not a hobby. I can see working with psychedelics become a substantial part of what I do professionally, but it's not there. A very small amount of my clients are in that space. I founded the interest group in coaching and psychedelics of the Mind Foundation. We ran a group on Facebook called Coaching and Psychedelics for a little while now. So we have some conversations in that space, but I don't describe myself as a psychedelic integration coach. But for me, that's in the category existential coaching, really, or positive existential coaching, as I would call it. But at some point, I considered not to call it coaching at all and just calling it sitting down with Yannick, because with a lot of the coaches that I work with, it became this integrative approach that uses elements of coaching, elements of supervision, elements of training, elements of business mentoring. So I called that rocket supervision to give it another label. But I think a good coach will draw on different hats, different professional hats, and wear them as they are appropriate. So when I have a consultation with somebody now, we agree, client and I, we're partnering, and we agree on which of my professional hats would they like to have access to. Sometimes that's more of the traditional existential coaching. Sometimes it's more of a positive psychology approach and working with happiness interventions or character strength or this kind of thing. On some occasions, is, I had a psychedelic experience, or I want to have one, and I want to draw on some of these hats in order to support me with that. In the psychedelic space, my hat is mostly my coaching hat. As soon as you put any form of suggestions on the table, you also take responsibility. And for me, that's a bit too hot to touch. I need my clients to make those decisions firmly themselves, because I'm not going to take responsibility for what somebody puts into their body. These substances can be really powerful, and the so-called bad trip or very challenging trips are a thing, and anybody who's looked into that topic long enough will have come across accounts of trips that were resembling insanity or, ego death, really difficult, uncomfortable experiences that people often have. It can also be the most beautiful, profound, meaningful experience of your life, but it can also put you into a state where you think you're clinically insane. And as Sam Harris described it, climbing up the mountain of pain and staying for 1,000 years or something like that. So everybody has to make these decisions themselves. And that's one of my conditions. I'm not going to sway you in any direction. My clients need to be up for that and making those decisions themselves.
That's really interesting, because now that I'm thinking about it after you describe it, it's really still about the client, right? So if you name yourself as an integration coach, then therefore they kind of have to buy into psychedelics to be able to work with you. So what I'm saying is people that claim themselves as integration coaches, kind of this client must take psychedelics in order to work with them. We're there for the client. It's up to the client. And so you're leaving it open, meaning that it still is for the client.
Yeah, there's still ongoing debate whether a coach who's working with psychedelic integration needs to know a lot about psychedelics. From my own experiences, I think it's important that you kind of have some reference point to what they're bringing into the space. But I can also see that it might be almost in the way at times when you make certain assumptions about what your trip might have been like. There's certainly parallels to people's experiences, but I think there's many coaches who coach CEOs and they've never been a CEO. Do you need to have had that experience in order to coach somebody going through that experience? Every CEO will have their own experience of what it's like to be a CEO and carry responsibility, making difficult decisions, things like that. But if coaching for you is a space that you create where your client gets to think and make decisions, and you facilitate and you reflect back and you hold space, and you're partnering with your client, but they make the decisions and you facilitate that process, then similarly, you don't really need to to have had the same experience. You just need to hold space where they can make sense of the experience. So I think this is where practitioners go far apart, because there's so many coaches who have a strong training or mentoring element to their work, who make a lot of suggestions or give advice or guide or direct. Other coaches, they're not. They're being more of the traditional puristic coaches. They're more facilitating. And I think the less facilitating you are, the more responsibility you take for where your client is going, for better or for worse. And when it comes to psychedelics, I would just be very careful with taking responsibility for where your client is going.
It's interesting you say that too. I feel like, I don't know about in the UK, but here in the United States, I feel like there's two schools of coaching. Like you just said, there's the coaches, they're like, this is my program, this is what I do, you buy into this. And then there's coaches where I'm more on board. It's like the client comes to me and I help facilitate what they want to get. And I think that's been one of the blockers for me, is seeing these other coaches that I don't see eye to eye with them. And it's like, I don't want to be perceived as that person that, has the program, has the thing. And so within the UK, psychedelics are legal there. What are the rules around it? What are the challenges you face? It sounds like you say you really look up to the client and then you're there for the client within whatever realm they want to explore. But how do you deal with the law?
When I moved to the UK, they were selling mushrooms on the market in Camden, and I wasn't into any of that stuff at all. So I didn't really know what was going on. And now sometimes I look back, it's like, it's not too long ago. This was 2005, where, you could sell them legally. Now that changed a lot. There's history involved in terms of political space. Without getting too much into it, it is illegal to grow. It is certainly illegal for any kind of coach to provide any kind of substances. And there's no legal retreat centers in the UK. So for coaches, the only possibility to do anything legally is to, first of all, if somebody comes to you for integration, they've had an experience. Legally, that's not an issue. They come to you with an experience and you provide a space where they can make sense of an experience. If they would then tell you, and I will do this again next Saturday, and you're setting intentions and goals around that, then you're colluding with your client on doing an illegal activity. So that's not something you can do as a professional coach. If somebody so the integration work is relatively that there's not really an issue or concern around it, because people can talk to you about whatever they want. If you have a feeling that somebody might get harmed, then you have an obligation to intervene, so that harm is defined in some way. There is an ethical assessment involved. I ask my clients to do this legally. And there are some retreat centers with a good reputation. The UK Psychedelic Society does regular trips, or used to do before the pandemic, to legal retreat centers. But I make sure that my clients make decisions that keep them safe. If I have any concerns about their safety, I will bring that up with them. And I work with people who are generally resourceful and whole and not vulnerable. So those people that I work with, they are going to be in a position where they can make those decisions and they can make smart decisions. But ultimately, it's up to them. So when it comes to preparation, I think coaches need to be a bit more careful, because that involves the client making decisions on where to do something. And I just need to make sure, as a professional coach, that's all legal. Ultimately, my client will make their decisions on what they will do and what they won't do, but I'm not going to be promoting or colluding or supporting my client in doing anything illegal. That's my line, and I make that very clear to clients. And if they then come back and they have had an experience, then we can start the integration work. I don't sit with clients. I know some coaches, they're also sitting with the client through the psychedelic experience. And I think that's a completely different thing to coaching. And we just talked about it in an earlier session. First of all, I'm not considering doing any sitting for a client while they're having the experience. First of all, because I don't have experience enough in sitting with people. And also, they would be tempted to have a conversation with their coach, as they're having that experience, maybe not on the peak of the experience, but as it's kind of fading off. They might ask you some questions, and I would probably want to engage in a conversation. And I know that while they're in a vulnerable state, I don't think that's useful. I'm not sure. At this point, I'm just just not sure whether that's going to be a valuable conversation. I don't think anybody should be doing any coaching while somebody's tripping, but at the same time, I had some conversations that were incredibly valuable while I was coming off a trip. I don't know. As a professional, it's very clear for me. I don't do any coaching while somebody's under the influence of a drug. I wouldn't coach somebody who's drunk. I wouldn't coach somebody who's super high on adrenaline. I wouldn't coach somebody who's under the influence of a psychedelic or any other substance that like really changes their state of consciousness. As a person, and as a scientist, I'm curious about what might happen if you were to do that. But we don't know enough about that to keep a client safe. So at this point, for me, it's very clear. Integration, absolutely fine. Prep, I need to make very sure that this client is resourceful and whole and generally okay, not suffering from a mental illness of some sort. Difficult to draw the line sometimes, at what point do you become depressed? I think these are the same rules that apply to any coaching. Any coach would draw a line somewhere between at what point of feeling a bit depressed does it become depression and they're better off with a therapist? At what point of being a bit moody and going up and down, at what point does that become a bipolar disorder? And at what point is that better for that person to work not with a coach but with a mental health professional? So in that sense, again, I don't think it's any different from normal coaching, but I think the stakes are much higher because that person is potentially going to take a psychedelic which can exacerbate or like really deepen that kind of experience or potentially trigger an existing predisposition. Professional coaches just need to be careful when they doing work with preparation. And at the moment, I don't touch the space in between. I offer to be around in the vicinity. If somebody wanted to go to a retreat center in the Netherlands, for example, and they want their coach around, perhaps the next day, they can have a coaching session on site. So if anything were to happen, they know that somebody that they trust can be there within 5 minutes. I think that that's a service I offer, but I haven't done that yet actually because it just people didn't ask for it. It's also quite expensive to fly in your coach into a different country just to kind of have them around.
Let's say psychedelics were completely legal. Would you feel any differently? Would you want to sit with clients? It sounds like you don't, that you really see the space of coaching and being in a vulnerable state as different. What would your utopian coaching practice look like?
Well, if it were legal, we would start doing a lot of research and look at, very systematically at what do we need, what's happening when somebody gets coached on psychedelics. But even with legal substances, we need to pass stringent ethic committees. So you can't just give somebody something. I mean, even if you want to research people who had a drink, you need to be very careful, and it's very complicated to get approval for these kind of studies. In my ideal world, we would have already done 20, 30 years of research, and we would have developed methodologies on what would be a good way to move through that. What I can imagine is that you would have a good relationship with a sitter. You would have the coach and the person who would sit with a client would talk to each other with the permission of the client, obviously, so that the sitter may take notes or, write certain things down that seem to be significant words that the client might have said or repeated. Interesting situations or any significant moments could then be communicated to the coach, and we could start the coaching conversation based on some of these insights that sometimes the clients forget. I could see how a coach could also be a sitter, but I think they would need it to be very boundaried and make it very clear why they're there for and what their role is. Pretty much all sitters I've talked to said very clearly, don't interfere with the experience. You're there to hold space. Maybe reassure them that they're doing fine and it's okay, and they're doing great and they're not at any risk of harm. But it's a very different thing to coaching. And personally, I would probably be tempted to coach, and I don't want to coach. I would want to do that after. Part of me would want to sit through it and kind of see it and experience it. It might add something to the coaching if you can hold that boundary very clearly. And I just don't have any experience with sitting while being the coach, so that's not something I would do. I'm sure others will and are successfully doing so.
So almost a multidisciplinary approach. You have the sitter, you have the coach, the client, and that's a really interesting way to look at it. Are you ever interested in trying to be a coach and a sitter just to see what the experience is like if it was allowed?
Well, I would be lying if I wouldn't say I'm not interested. It's not on the cards professionally. So maybe at some point in the future, I'll do a training in sitting, and I'll find a way to gain the necessary experience of sitting with somebody professionally. And I might combine the skills that I have in coaching and the skills that I have in sitting and combine them. For me personally, I mean, maybe it's also part of my character is I want to do things properly. I don't want to take risk when it comes to working with powerful substances just as such. I would want to gain sufficient experience in sitting before I would attempt to combine the two or offer them at the same time.
So I live in Oakland, California, which is the second city in the United States to decriminalize psychedelic plants. So that includes sales and all sorts of things. However, it's still illegal on a state and federal level. So I just feel like I know a lot of sitters. I know a lot of people that are kind of combining lots of different ways of doing it. And so I feel like it's almost normalized to me that you would maybe mash the two together. And so it is great hearing your perspective, because I think you're right. We have to be super safe. They're very powerful substances.
Where I hear the opinions go very far apart is where's that line between coaching and therapy? And in a way, I've been discussing that since I started coaching. As I said, I was always interested in going that little bit deeper. So we're still discussing among existential coaches where that line is between coaching and therapy. There's some good frameworks. There's some good starting points. You know, the coaching is more about surface level change, whereas therapy is more deep-seated change. It's a good starting point, not necessarily true, but there's certainly a trend in that. Similarly with coaches working with people who are resourceful and whole versus therapists who tend to work with people who are broken or unable to cope. It's certainly not always true, but it's a good starting point. Also, the notion that coaches often work with the present and the future, and therapists work more with the past and the present. Certainly not always true, but all three together can give you a more of an idea of what the difference between coaching and therapy is. But ultimately, every practitioner needs to, what I always call, frame their space. Sometimes you frame your space firmly in the performance coaching in organizations area, and maybe you work with stress reduction and communication styles, or you work with using mindfulness. Some practitioners frame their space very much in the therapeutic. I work with bereavement, and I work with autism, or I work with post-traumatic stress. You need to frame that space and offer your services within that. Here's what I can and here's what I can't do. Here's what I want to do and here's what I don't want to do. You know, so I always say you need to be willing and able to provide the service that you're offering to that client. Just because a client comes with an ail, like a pain or something they want to work on, doesn't mean that you have to provide that service. If somebody comes and they say, well, I'm very depressed, I want to, move and find a new house, then you can use some coaching techniques potentially to help that person move house. If it's not about the resolving the root of their depression, which is much better suited in a therapy room, then perhaps a coach can provide tremendous value. If somebody's just lost somebody, I can potentially have a very effective existential conversation about the meaning of endings and how they relate to that, to then move forward with their life. But chances are that if somebody's gone through a bereavement, they might not be able to engage in that kind of conversation to move forward. Chances are they just have to process that and make sense of it. I may or may not have the skills to have that conversation with them. But every coach, every therapist, every practitioner needs to have that conversation with themselves and be able to communicate what their framework is and at what point there might be a line. And when that line comes, when you're using psychedelics or when in the psychedelic space, I think that line gets crossed much more easily than in coaching as usual, if we wanted to call it like that. It's much more likely that somebody comes back from such an experience and some doors opened into a space where maybe as a coach you have nothing to do there. You know, maybe that's something they need to work with somebody else. So I think it's so important that coaches who work in the psychedelic space have a solid referral network and a whole range of therapists available at their fingertips that they can refer clients to if that should be necessary. You generally work with people who are resourceful and whole, as I said, who are generally okay. And sometimes for people who are generally okay, they open a door and there's a world of pain behind it and they didn't know. and at that point, maybe it's better to refer them. Maybe they just have a really pleasant experience and they have their next amazing business idea. That also has happened. And you just never quite know where the psychedelic experience will lead you, where you will end up, what you will end up knowing or experiencing. So I think as a coach, when you open that space and somebody has an experience and they come back and they've opened all these doors and they talk about it now, you just need to be very aware of what they're bringing and at what point you will need to, at what point is the client better off working with somebody else? I think that's the ultimate line.
Do you think there's a space for maybe, again, a multidisciplinary approach with a sitter, a coach, and a therapist that all can communicate and come up, help the client together?
Absolutely. I'm a fan of working in collaboration with people. I've started that with other coaches so that there's like a ping pong approach, so to speak, where a client has two coaches, one who works on the existential foundations and the other one works with performance and behavior and accountability. One kind of what drives me and the other one, how can I get shit done? I can imagine a similar, and I've worked in the past, not in the psychedelic space, but I've worked with some therapists in parallel. And I love it when a coaching client comes to me and it says, I'm also working with a therapist. Is that an issue? And I'm like, no, this is great, because we have a safety net for when things open up that, we feel this is not really a coaching issue right now, or this is not really a coaching thing. They can take that to the therapist. This is amazing. So yes, I would love to see more coaches and therapists partnering up.
Have you ever had a conversation with someone's therapist while you were working with a client?
Yeah, I was amazed at how eager some of the clients were. That it's like, oh yeah, you can talk to my therapist. They tend to appreciate that. We just need to work in a three-way container so that we're all aware of what we're doing there. Setting something up as a three-way relationship, that would be amazing. I haven't done that yet. So from the very beginning that you would say, okay, coach, therapist, and client meet up on a three-way Zoom. Then you discuss the framework of what we're doing here. And at what point would you go see one or the other? And, would coach and therapist then check in regularly, or, how would that look like? I mean, the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, as a nurse, I mean, a lot of what I do is work with a multidisciplinary team with a neurologist, neurosurgeon, everyone, and coming up to help the patient in the best way. And so it would make sense in this space to be able to have a team approach for the client. And yeah, it sounds like a really amazing opportunity. And it sounds like it's worked for you, or worked for the client, worked for your client.
It feels safer when you know that your client has a therapist that is just on the other end of a phone line, or that they're already scheduled to meet regularly. It does make you feel safer as a coach.
What is the stigma like in the UK? Do you feel like you've had to come out as someone who works with psychedelics? Do you feel like it's very normal in your society? How do your friends and family, like your community, feel about you do?
About a year and a half ago, I think now, I've decided to put an event on, the first online symposium on coaching and psychedelics, with a colleague of mine who was very unapologetically out there, and I came more from a cautious scientific perspective, and she came in from an activist perspective. We gelled quite well. We really like each other. So we put on this event, and as I was about to post that up on Facebook, I did definitely hesitate. It's like, who's going to see this? Am I going to be out myself? There's definitely opinions around and associations and preconceptions about what does it mean? What do psychedelics mean? If somebody says, I'm working as a coach in the psychedelic space, that can brand you with certain people. My supervisor very clearly said some organizations will not hire you if they find out that you are involved in that kind of activity. I think so. We need to ask ourselves some questions around how might that affect your career or your relationships. I think people who know and respect me, they will know that I'm a curious mind and I have always explored space and I've asked deep questions. So it would probably make a lot of sense for people knowing that I've been working in that space. But there was certainly a concern. I'm married in a bit more conservative family and I might move to Mexico in a couple of years. So there's, in a way, that's where a lot of that kind of culture comes from. But also there's people who think more conservatively. And so I was somewhat concerned, but at the end, I think we need to show up authentically and do what we're passionate about and what we're interested in. And I think the potential in this space is just enormous. And anybody who I have a conversation with, I can come from a scientific perspective. And I think this is something I've learned from my contacts in Berlin, from the Mind Foundation as well. As soon as you take a science perspective on this and you're coming from an academic route and you're saying, here's the evidence to support that it's useful to explore more and create more knowledge. And I believe I have enough academic grounding to make a solid argument that the work I'm doing is safe, useful, and worth exploring. So in that sense, I know some people will probably judge me and I would not have a chance to have a conversation with them. Fair play, that's okay with me. But if somebody is surprised and they would ask me about it, I think we would have a really interesting conversation. I might still not agree that, that is something worthwhile pursuing, maybe based on information or misinformation or, as the war on drugs has been raging and there's still in a lot of people's minds, it's the devil's drug that makes people go crazy. But I think the science very clearly says something else. And that's where I choose to get my knowledge from.
Do you want to be an advocate for psychedelic medicine? It sounds like you kind of maybe don't, that you want to allow people to come to their own conclusions. But do you feel that you do kind of want to stick up for psychedelics and help people understand that maybe?
Yeah, I think the evidence that it can be a tremendously powerful treatment for disorders and illnesses is there, and it's growing. So what I would like to see is more research so that we can be absolutely sure that, this is the power that lies within using that within a coaching framework. I wouldn't say that I'm an advocate for... I think I can say I'm an advocate for psychedelic medicine. I think it's undoubtedly so much potential there. And we don't know quite enough yet to give everybody psychedelics. There's plenty of people who shouldn't take psychedelics. I'm convinced of that. So we need to create a bit more knowledge. But when it comes to coaching, it's not about general knowledge. It's not about trying to find the truth with a capital T. It's not about generalizing what is and isn't good for people. Coaching is about creating a space where people can make decisions and choices. So that's why, as a scientist, I'm an advocate of doing a lot more research into coaching and psychedelics as a medicine. Absolutely. As a coach, I'm not an advocate. I'm an advocate for people to make choices that will better their lives. And I think psychedelics have the potential to do that. I would encourage anybody to explore the potential that their life is offering and that life is offering. So in that sense, there's a difference between me, the scientist, and the academic, and me, the coach. And then there's me, Yannick.
So you're not an advocate on a personal level, but are you an advocate on a societal level, on a fight for it becoming legal so we can do research?
100%. I think we need research. And I think the evidence is so clear that everything speaks for the potential. And I think it's important to explore that. So yes, absolutely. I can only see it go in one direction, which is that it's going to become an accepted medicine. It might take a while. The process to have MDMA, which is still in the family of psychedelics, as an accepted treatment method, started in 1986 when Rick Doblin under MAPS first sent off a form and said, we need to be looking into this. So it took 30 years or so for it to go in phase 3 trials. When we look at coaching, I think Henrik Jungabele, he said there's an effort to look into coaching and psychedelics on an academic level, but he reckons it's going to be another 10 years or so until we have some more solid findings. It's incredibly difficult to study coaching as it is because it's so ill-defined and there's such a broad range of what it is and isn't, and it's so dependent on the relationship between coach and client that it's difficult to find out which kind of methodology might be more powerful. So there's huge methodological flaws when we're trying to research it. That's why I've moved a little bit away from the science of coaching because it's a very individual one-to-one thing. I value it. It's important to look into it and create arguments for it to gather some data. But when it comes to coaching, it's a one-to-one thing. It's giving a client a space where they can make decisions and choices about their life and they take responsibility. That's my existential philosophy. We take responsibility for our choices. I want to create a space where people can powerfully change their lives. And it's been shown that both experientially and also from the research that psychedelics can offer that to people to powerfully change their lives and gain new insights from a completely new perspective. That's saying that when you step back a step and look at your situation from the outside. Psychedelics often means you're, going into orbit and looking down not just a few steps, but like getting a completely fresh perspective on your life and how you're living it. So the potential of that is amazing. You just need to keep people safe. That's it. And I think when coaching clients will know how to keep themselves safe, and they know best. And if I ever feel that somebody's not safe, I'll say something, I'll challenge them on that. If they still want to do something that I would deem as unsafe, I will have to reconsider whether I want to keep supporting them on that road.
So I know you're going to say it's up to the client and it's not, but I'm curious what your personal views are on the different psychedelic substances and drugs, MDMA versus psilocybin versus LSD, DMT. Do you have a preference or not? For yourself and not for your clients, but do you think there's any, I guess my question is on the different substances, what do you think their use is with coaching?
Yeah, so I've talked to some coaches who said they only work with psilocybin because it's relatively short, like a couple of hours, 3, 4, 5 hours. Acid, LSD can last a very long time. But it depends what the client wants, depends how much experiences they've had, what they are maybe familiar with. MDMA comes with more of a connection, but also there's a depletion of serotonin afterwards. So you might have that kind of come down, even though the come down is interestingly not so severe when it's used in a therapeutic setting. But then people with heart problems need to be very careful with MDMA. I think this is an area where I, as a coach, feel I know a lot of stuff, but I don't feel I know enough to give any kind of suggestions or advice. I know some coaches working in this space, they're happy to offer their knowledge and they guide clients much more in the preparation stage. They would share their experiences and other people's experiences. There's a couple of sources from institutions that I trust that I would point them to. I would send them to look at MAPS resources. Psychedelic Explorer's Guide by James Fadiman is a really good resource. There's a couple of resources that I would recommend people start with when they want to educate themselves. But ultimately, they need to educate themselves. Again, I'm not going to recommend anything. I'm not going to listen to a client and then say, oh, I think for your particular context, ayahuasca would be really useful. And I would recommend that. I wouldn't do that.
Well, that was one of my questions too, is how do you educate yourself and how to become the most prepared?
The classic coach response would be, what do you think? Where might you start such a journey? And then the client might say, oh, I might Google it. What would you find? Maybe we do it now. Or like, how would they ascertain what are good sources and not so good sources? Who might they know who they could talk to? And how reliable that is? How do they generally learn and get their information? Somebody might watch a lot of YouTube videos. Another person might go to the library. Somebody else might have a lot of conversations. It really depends on the person, how they choose to get their knowledge. If somebody brings me knowledge that goes against what I know and it feels dangerous, if they say, oh, I've heard about this Iboga thing and, I hear it's like 100% safe, then as a coach, I have an obligation to say, that's not what I heard. That's really interesting. Tell me about that. Here's something that I've heard, or here's a source that I've read that pointed out some of the risks. But throughout that kind of process, you get to know your client. You get to know how your client creates knowledge and how they learn and how they challenge themselves. Somebody might question a lot and somebody might be very risk averse and somebody else might be quite bold. These are all things that a good coach will reflect back and offer it out to people so that your client can make better decisions. But yeah, again, I'd be very cautious to recommend or suggest anything.
Well, and that's educating your clients. What would you recommend other coaches, how they should educate themselves?
There's some information out there on generally how psychedelics work. Obviously, if I come from an academic perspective, I would turn to science and leading academics in this field. The Imperial College Center, Robert Card Harris, then Stan Grof did a lot of work in psychedelics, using it for growth and therapy. So I would look to the institutions that I trust. I like reading books. So that would be something that I use to kind of educate myself. But I think as long as they seek information and they develop an attitude of healthy, critical respect and curiosity, that somebody doesn't just, take all the information, but, they actively encourage in the coaching space to question what they learn and to build a knowledge base that will allow them to make these decisions, which are important decisions, and not just kind of jump into an experience like that. Like, not encourage them to have the respect, but like if you instill a sense of healthy respect towards what they're about to embark on without, necessarily scaring them about it. But like, I think if somebody doesn't feel good about it because there might be a risk attached, maybe it's not for them, because there is some risk. The physical risk with SN psilocybin is very low. Like, there's no lethal dose that we have found yet. It might trigger something. It might feel very uncomfortable, but it could also be the best experience of your life. You just don't really know.
How important is it, do you think, to have your own psychedelic experiences to work with clients in this field?
I think it allows you to relate to your client that bit more. Most CEOs work with coaches who have been CEOs or who have worked with a lot of CEOs. So it's a similar thing. Like, we tend to hire coaches from the space in which we are operating in. It doesn't mean that somebody who's coming in from the outside cannot hold a really good space for you. I think when it comes to preparation work, it would be a natural choice to work with somebody who's had experiences and who has knowledge. But you need to contract carefully with your coach on how they will be working with you. So if there's a client out there looking for a coach, to ask your coach to what extent they're willing to give you advice and guide you. Coaches should contract with their clients and tell them to what extent they're willing to take on responsibility, or when they do give some advice or guidance, to what extent they can trust that kind of advice and guidance. Because it's easy to put somebody into an expert position and then kind of follow what they tell you. That can get you into some trouble when that kind of stuff doesn't work out. Imagine you pay somebody a large amount of money to guide you through a psychedelic experience, and then you have a really shitty time. You might want your money back. What's that going to be like for you as a coach? Or, in America, people like to sue each other. What happens if there's some really well-intentioned advice that works for most people most of the time, or has worked for all people all the time so far, and then there's this one person that it just doesn't, which might happen. So how are you going to deal with that? I think it makes sense to have had some experiences, but if you're the kind of coach who holds space and facilitates a process of somebody making sense of an experience, I don't think you necessarily need to have done psychedelics. If a normal coach who doesn't have any experiences sits down with one of their clients, and in their 5th session, the client comes in and said, by the way, last weekend I've had this psychedelic experience and this happened, and I've had these insights, and I've been asking some questions about who I am and how I live my life. I think most coaches will work with that. Will say, tell me about it. These are important questions for the coaching space. I don't think any coach would reject that because, oh no, this is like an illegal experience and I have to refer you to somebody else. I think a good coach will say that these sound like really important questions. Would you like to make sense of them?
Do you think they should be illegal? What is your opinion on?
Yeah. Personally, I think they should be legal. In Portugal, they've decriminalized all drugs. I think most of the experiments that have been done where drugs were legal, they haven't led to the effects that everybody seems to be scared of. The war on drugs clearly doesn't work. People have a natural tendency to want to change their state of consciousness. They drink, they smoke, they get adrenaline into their body through sports or any other form of kind of excitement. We screw with our brain chemistry all the time. Kids spin around in circles until they're dizzy. It seems to be a natural urge or a natural desire to change our state of consciousness. States of flow in positive psychology. Stephen Kotler does some great work around the Flow Genome Project. I think like heightened state of consciousness or changed states of consciousness is something that people crave. I think it's much safer when they're decriminalized. I mean, obviously, there's some really, really dangerous substances that are highly addictive. If my children were to get into crack, cocaine, or methamphetamine, then I would try to do whatever I can to keep them off that. But as Sam Harris said at some point, if his daughter would live their lives and never having tried any psychedelic substance, he felt that they would probably miss out on something or a wonderful opportunity to see the world from a different angle. So there's definitely some truth to that. And I think people need to make their own decisions, and education is very important. Yeah, probably wait a while. I've waited for a long time before I tried psychedelics. I was much, much older, and I valued that experience a lot more because I wasn't so young and my brain was still developing. Because there is some research that while the brain is still developing, you can really screw with some brain chemistry.
It's interesting you say that. I didn't try anything besides cannabis until my 30s as well, or to my 30s. But I was at a MAPS conference and Rick Doblin was saying that he felt that MDMA was almost like a bar mitzvah for his children. And when his children turned 13, he offered them to do MDMA with him and they all refused. And he said, the best way to get your kids not to do drugs is to offer them drugs. But scientifically, MDMA is quite safe for a young brain. I don't think doing it a lot and definitely not off the streets and, where there's other things mixed in. But it is really interesting because I personally am with you that I think it is something for an older brain that you do need to know who you are and kind of where you are in life to be able to deal with the challenges it brings up.
There was a client who approached me who's experienced ego death on an acid trip when he was 14. And I'm like, wow, that will have quite an effect on you. And it sounded like a very positive effect, but like it certainly changes people.
So young. It's just interesting. And then, for Rick Doblin to say, like, I offered this to my children at 13.
I was way older when I drank beer.
Really? What are you excited about for the future? The future of psychedelics, for the future of coaching in psychedelics, for yourself personally?
I'd be really excited about better training. I'm excited about creating some sort of methodology of how this might work. I'm excited about more people who are very ethically minded and academically minded and sharing knowledge. I'm excited about sharing resources and experiences. And this is partly why I'm so excited about the interest group in coaching and psychedelics, because there's practicing coaches exchanging knowledge and exchanging views, because it's been something that's not really been talked about. People held back. They don't want to be seen as people working in that space. Now that the science is there, it's much more accepted. It's much more okay to go out and talk about psychedelics without risking your career or being labeled a hippie. Now that, people in Silicon Valley microdose, and like there's people like Tim Ferriss and Sam Harris talk about psychedelics a lot. There's a lot of research funds, whole leadership groups do ayahuasca somewhere on their vision quest. It's exciting that people talk about it, because I believe that we can learn stuff when we talk about things. I mean, this is the profession I'm in. And the more we exchange our views and the more we talk and argue and debate and exchange resources, exchange concerns and criticize each other, then open a space where we can come together and respectfully, disagree. The whole field grows, and it grows exponentially fast.
What do you wish you had known when you were starting out? What advice would you give to someone starting out?
I wish I would have had a list of other people who are working in this space. I wish I would have had a reading list somewhere where all of these information are kind of combined. I wish that I would have found other coaches who are kind of openly talking about that. And I guess that's why we started this group as well. I've just earlier, somebody in our drop-in sessions, we have these bi-weekly drop-in sessions for coaching and psychedelics. By the time you're hearing this, I hope they're still running and they will continue to do so. But somebody asked, she said she's curious about the websites of coaches who are practicing or who are offering this kind of work to clients. And so we shared a few of ours in the group, but then if you Google, there's 2 pages or so of psychedelic integration coaches out there. So I just kind of compiled them in a Google document and added a form where people can add other coaches who are practicing in the space. I'll do that as soon as we get off this call. I'm going to create a link that's called bit.ly/psychedelic coaching directory. bit.ly/psychedelic coaching directory. I'm going to create that shortcut and get it to that form. And then people who know somebody who's a coach and works in the psychedelic space, they can add them. Or if you are a coach working in the psychedelic space, you can add your own details. Then perhaps over time, we can create a database of coaches who legally work in psychedelic integration. And then maybe we can reach out and learn from each other, not just as practitioners, but also clients will have an address where they can, filter people by what kind of training and qualifications would they like them to have, what kind of price range are they looking for, where in the world is somebody and might be able to support them in person after this whole COVID thing is over. So I think that's a good start. And I think that's something I wish I would have had more touch points between people who are working in this space, because they generally are quite approachable.
Sounds like you almost want to start your own psychedelic coaching association.
I could see that in the future. At the moment, I can't really take on any more work, but I can certainly see how this interest group might become an association or some form of body. But I think it'll be a long time before we can bring psychedelic integration coaches or psychedelic coaches together under one banner, agreeing on the kind of framework that this should be practiced under. I think there's too much autonomy and such a broad range. I mean, it's difficult enough to get coaching together under one banner. So it'll be interesting. What I would like is a space where people talk, and I don't need people to accept any rules or any framework. I just want to bring people together and talk about their different views and their different experiences so that everybody can make up their own mind. I think that's very much an existential perspective on this kind of thing.
There's no one right way. It's whatever.
Yeah. I mean, we all need to make those decisions. How you practice in that space is something that's deeply personal. And while you might be guided, and there will be frameworks in the future that says, this is how you do a psychedelic integration coaching, and this is the kind of method that is proven or whatever, how to do it most effectively. But ultimately, we can only take those suggestions or, pieces of research or opinions or guidelines or frameworks, and we question them. And we look into them, we try to understand them, and then we make our own decision. Is there something that is valuable that I can integrate into the way that I practice? Is there something I reject strongly, which will help me to have a better understanding of what I think is right? If we are faced with something that we think is wrong, we are one step closer to figuring out how to do it, by how not to do it. So, that's why it's good. It's good to put your stuff out there and let other people grapple with it. And some will disagree and some will agree. And then you find the clients for whom that works. I know that there'll be a client who will want their coach to tell them which substance to take and which retreat center to go to. Then I'm just not the right coach for them, and that's totally okay. Somebody else might be willing to take on that responsibility, and they might be doing their clients a favor. But there's so many different people out there, so that's why it's important to talk to each other, and for clients to talk to a couple of different coaches and have a conversation and ask their coaches, how do you coach? What's your process? How much are you going to be doing for me? What can I expect from you? What do you expect from me? These are important questions that coach and client need to talk about.
Yeah, it sounds so exciting to hear, to have a group of coaches together, discuss and maybe even argue and talk about it. And then I realized maybe that's what this podcast gets to do a little bit.
Exactly. And I would really like to see, us continue doing this and talk to a range of other practicing coaches. If you're listening to this and you're a practicing psychedelic coach, do get in touch with us. It would be nice to have a conversation with other people who work with clients and how they see their practice and what do they do, what might be your methodology, or what do you agree or disagree with what I just thrown into the room. So I'm excited to have a whole series of talking about coaching and psychedelics and get that out to whoever cares to listen.
That's actually perfect timing. Those are all my questions.
Great. Well, it felt like a good time to end. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. And I hope this is going to be the start of something beautiful and we're going to create a bunch of knowledge together. Maybe just to finish off, if you look for coaching and psychedelics on Facebook, you'll find our group, the Mind Foundation. If you Google that, it's Mind Foundation for I think psychedelic practice. I'm not sure exactly what they're in Berlin. And if you Google it, you'll find their forum and their website, so you can become a member and join our interest group in coaching and psychedelics. You can email me 42@existential.coach, and you'll find my psychedelic offer on existential.coach/psychedelic coaching. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. If anybody agrees, disagrees, we have a conversational space. I believe in everything what I just said. I think it's important to have these conversations, and I'm always delighted to hear from anybody with any opinions, comments, observations. And if you want more talking about coaching podcasts, we'll probably have this on YouTube, and we'll put this out on audio in some form. There's a Buzzsprout, Spotify, and Apple podcasts. There's a podcast I run with two of my colleagues called Talking About Coaching, which is the kind of normal talking about coaching, where we address questions from coaches. But there's a long form version of this, which is this kind of conversation. So Google it. If not, let me know and I'll tell you where it is. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.